Captain Preston Kingsley stormed across the federal courthouse parking lot, barked orders at 3 junior officers, shoved past courthouse security, and grabbed the black woman by her arm before slamming her against his patrol car. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," the 20-year veteran shouted, pressing his knee into her back while she calmly stated, "Captain, I am Federal Judge Yvonne Sterling, and you need to step back immediately." The racist officer laughed until she recited his badge number, his supervisor's name, and the exact federal statute he was violating, details that only someone with supreme judicial authority would know. What Captain Kingsley didn't realize was that attacking the wrong person in the wrong place would trigger consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another citizen who needed to be put in her place. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the price of one moment of racist arrogance. This is the story of how one decision destroyed everything, and why you'll never forget what comes next. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, when two very different worlds collided in the most catastrophic way possible outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in Atlanta, Georgia. Federal Judge Yvonne Sterling had just concluded a grueling 14-hour day presiding over a complex federal racketeering case involving the largest organized crime syndicate in the Southeast. At 45, she had earned her reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the Southern District of Georgia, known for her razor-sharp intellect, unwavering integrity, and calm demeanor under pressure that had never once been broken in 25 years of legal practice. Tonight, she carried her leather briefcase containing sensitive federal case files, classified documents from the Department of Justice, and evidence from ongoing investigations that could topple corrupt officials across 3 states as she walked toward her silver Mercedes in the courthouse's secure parking garage. The weight of her responsibility was immense. The racketeering case she was overseeing involved allegations of corruption that reached into local police departments, city government, and federal agencies. For months, she had been receiving subtle threats and intimidation attempts from people who wanted these investigations to disappear. Federal marshals had increased security around her home and office, but Judge Sterling refused to be intimidated by criminals who thought they could corrupt the very system designed to hold them accountable. 3 blocks away, Police Captain Preston Kingsley was having the worst month of his 20-year career, but not for reasons anyone suspected. Budget cuts had intensified pressure from the mayor's office, his clearance rates were down 15%, and Internal Affairs had received 3 complaints about his officers' aggressive tactics in the past 2 weeks. What the public didn't know was that Kingsley was desperately trying to keep federal investigators from discovering a network of corruption that had been operating within his department for over a decade. At 52, Kingsley prided himself on being an old-school cop who believed in showing authority first and asking questions later. But his definition of authority had been twisted by years of unchecked power, racist ideology, and a belief that his badge gave him the right to treat certain citizens as less than human. Tonight, he was leading what appeared to be a routine drug sweep operation, but was actually an attempt to intimidate witnesses who had been cooperating with federal investigators looking into police misconduct patterns in his department. The operation had yielded nothing but paperwork and frustrated officers, which only increased Kingsley's rage. He knew that federal eyes were watching his department, and every failed operation made him look more incompetent to supervisors who were already questioning his effectiveness. His network of protection within the department was beginning to show cracks, and internal affairs investigations that he had previously been able to control were now being handled by federal oversight. The call came in at 8:45 p.m. through the department's dispatch system. Suspicious activity reported near Federal Courthouse, multiple individuals seen loitering in parking area. The dispatcher's voice carried the routine tone of hundreds of similar calls, but Kingsley's jaw tightened as he heard the address. Federal property meant federal oversight, federal paperwork, and federal headaches. More importantly, it meant the possibility of federal agents witnessing how he conducted operations. But a call was a call, and Kingsley never backed down from asserting his authority, regardless of jurisdiction. In his twisted worldview, backing down from any confrontation represented weakness that could undermine his entire network of control. He had built his career on never showing uncertainty, never admitting mistakes, and never allowing anyone to question his authority without facing consequences. Judge Sterling had just reached her car when she noticed the unusual activity unfolding in the visitor parking area. 3 police cruisers had surrounded a group of young men near the federal building's main entrance, their emergency lights creating a chaotic pattern of red and blue against the evening sky. She paused, observing the scene with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades in the criminal justice system and could recognize constitutional violations from 100 yards away. Something felt fundamentally wrong about the officers' positioning and their aggressive stance toward what appeared to be courthouse staff leaving their evening shifts after working late on federal cases. The body language of the detained individuals suggested confusion and fear rather than guilt or resistance. The officers' formation was designed for intimidation rather than investigation, and their positioning blocked security cameras in ways that suggested they were familiar with surveillance blind spots. Judge Sterling had seen this pattern before in her years as a civil rights attorney before joining the federal bench. It was the signature of officers who had learned to abuse their authority while avoiding accountability through careful positioning and witness intimidation. Her judicial training had taught her to observe details that ordinary citizens might miss, and everything about this scene suggested systematic misconduct rather than legitimate law enforcement. Kingsley arrived on scene in his department-issued Ford Explorer, emergency lights cutting through the humid Atlanta night like a declaration of war against anyone who might challenge his authority. He surveyed the situation with growing irritation, his face flushed with the anger of someone whose carefully planned operation was falling apart. His officers had detained 4 individuals, but it was becoming clear that this was going nowhere fast. The suspicious individuals turned out to be federal court clerks, paralegal assistants, and administrative staff working late on case preparations for tomorrow's hearings. "This is a complete waste of time," Kingsley muttered to Officer Quinn Ashworth, his newest team member who had been assigned to his unit just 8 months earlier. "But we're here now, so we're going to make sure everyone understands who's in charge around here." Ashworth, still relatively new to the department and not yet fully indoctrinated into Kingsley's culture of abuse, felt uncomfortable with the captain's tone and approach. He had joined the police force because he genuinely wanted to serve his community and protect citizens, not to intimidate federal employees who were simply doing their jobs. But he also understood that challenging a captain with 20 years of experience could end his career before it really began. Judge Sterling observed Kingsley's arrival and immediately recognized the dangerous shift in energy that his presence brought to the scene. In her years on the bench, she had seen this type of law enforcement officer before, the kind whose ego outweighed their judgment, whose need to demonstrate authority often led to violations of constitutional rights, and whose racist ideology shaped every interaction they had with citizens of color. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense as Kingsley's frustration mounted. Federal property meant federal jurisdiction, but local police could still operate within certain parameters as long as they followed proper procedures. However, Judge Sterling could see that proper procedures were the last thing on Kingsley's mind. His body language suggested someone preparing for confrontation rather than investigation. As Kingsley approached the detained court employees with obvious aggression, Judge Sterling made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She locked her car with deliberate precision, adjusted her briefcase containing classified federal documents, and walked toward the scene with the quiet confidence of someone whose federal judicial authority compelled her to ensure that proper constitutional procedures were being followed on federal property. What Captain Kingsley didn't know was that the woman questioning his authority held the power to trigger federal protocols that would expose everything he'd spent 20 years building. And every second of what happened next was being recorded by courthouse security systems that never stopped watching. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, you need to know exactly who these 2 people were, and why this particular collision was not just inevitable, but catastrophic for everything Kingsley had built over 2 decades. Judge Yvonne Sterling hadn't always worn judicial robes or commanded the respect that came with lifetime federal appointment. 20 years earlier, she had been a civil rights attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, specializing in police misconduct cases that other lawyers considered too dangerous or politically complicated to handle. She had built her career methodically and fearlessly, winning case after case against police departments that thought they were untouchable, exposing corruption networks that had operated with impunity for decades, and forcing systematic reforms that had transformed law enforcement practices across the South. Her reputation in civil rights law was legendary. She had successfully prosecuted police officers who thought their badges made them immune to consequences, exposed cover-up networks that reached into the highest levels of city government, and secured federal oversight for police departments that had systematically violated citizens' constitutional rights. Her cases had resulted in millions of dollars in settlements for victims of police abuse and had led to federal legislation that strengthened civil rights protections nationwide. Her appointment to the federal bench 5 years ago had been unanimously confirmed by the Senate, a rare occurrence in today's political climate that reflected the universal respect she commanded from both Democrats and Republicans. Even senators who typically opposed civil rights legislation had voted for her confirmation because her legal qualifications were unquestionable and her integrity was beyond reproach. What made Judge Sterling particularly dangerous to someone like Captain Kingsley was her encyclopedic knowledge of federal civil rights law combined with 25 years of experience fighting police corruption. She had memorized every statute, every precedent, every procedural requirement that governed police interactions with citizens. More importantly, she understood the federal mechanisms that could be triggered when law enforcement officers violated constitutional rights, especially on federal property where different rules applied and federal oversight was immediate and inescapable. Her federal security clearance gave her access to databases that tracked patterns of police misconduct across jurisdictions, allowing her to identify systemic problems that local oversight agencies often missed or ignored. Her judicial authority allowed her to issue federal warrants that local prosecutors couldn't challenge or suppress. Her personal relationships with federal prosecutors meant that civil rights violations would receive immediate attention rather than being buried in bureaucratic delays or political considerations. But most importantly, Judge Sterling possessed something that had made her legendary in civil rights circles: an absolute refusal to be intimidated by authority figures who use their power to oppress others. 20 years of facing down hostile police officers, corrupt officials, and racist judges had taught her that backing down from bullies only encouraged them to escalate their abuse. She had learned that sometimes the only way to protect the vulnerable was to confront the powerful directly, regardless of the personal consequences. Captain Preston Kingsley represented everything Judge Sterling had spent her career fighting against, but he was more dangerous than the typical corrupt cop because he had successfully hidden his crimes for 2 decades. His personnel file, if she had access to it, would have revealed a pattern that Internal Affairs had somehow overlooked through a combination of intimidation, cover-ups, and systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of the police department. 43 separate complaints of excessive force that were mysteriously withdrawn when victims were pressured or threatened. 27 allegations of racial bias that were dismissed when witnesses suddenly became unreliable or unavailable for testimony. 15 federal lawsuits settled by the city with confidential agreements that prevented victims from discussing their cases publicly. 7 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient evidence, despite compelling witness testimony and physical evidence that somehow disappeared from evidence lockers. Kingsley had survived and thrived in the department because he understood exactly how the system worked and had spent 20 years perfecting methods to avoid accountability. He knew which supervisors to cultivate through favors and shared corruption, which politicians to support through campaign contributions and helpful information about their opponents, and which community leaders to charm through public relations events while privately intimidating anyone who might challenge his authority. His closest ally was Lieutenant Vaughn Cartwright in Internal Affairs, who had been systematically burying complaints against Kingsley for over a decade in exchange for favorable testimony in other officers' disciplinary hearings and assistance with Cartwright's own misconduct cases. Their partnership had created a network of protection that had allowed both men to operate with virtual impunity while destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses who might threaten their arrangement. But Kingsley's network had a fatal weakness. It was entirely dependent on local politics and personal relationships that meant absolutely nothing when federal jurisdiction was involved. Federal prosecutors didn't care about local political considerations or departmental loyalty. Federal oversight operated by different rules, with different standards, and different consequences that no amount of local influence could control or mitigate. Tonight, that weakness was about to be exposed in the most devastating way possible, because Judge Sterling's authority didn't come from local politics or departmental connections. It came directly from the Constitution of the United States, and no police captain, regardless of his experience or connections, had the power to challenge or ignore federal judicial authority. The stage was set for a collision between 20 years of unchecked police corruption and the full weight of federal constitutional authority. Only one of them would survive what happened next. Little did anyone know that this routine evening would expose a pattern that had been hidden for decades. Because Judge Sterling wasn't just any federal judge, she was the one judge in the district with the authority to trigger immediate federal oversight of any law enforcement agency, and she had been quietly documenting patterns of police misconduct for years. "Hey, excuse me, officers," Judge Sterling said in her courtroom voice, clear and authoritative, developed through decades of controlling hostile legal proceedings where aggressive attorneys and dangerous defendants tried to intimidate her into backing down. "I'm wondering if I could understand the nature of this detention and the specific probable cause that justifies holding these individuals." The words were carefully chosen, using precise legal terminology that immediately identified her as someone with extensive knowledge of constitutional law and police procedures. Any competent officer would have recognized that they were dealing with someone who understood their legal rights and the limitations of police authority, especially on federal property where additional restrictions applied. Kingsley spun around, his face already flushed with annoyance from the failed operation and the growing realization that federal oversight was making his job increasingly difficult. In the dim parking lot lighting, he saw a well-dressed black woman in her 40s carrying a professional briefcase, questioning his authority with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Every prejudice, every frustration, every ounce of his wounded ego crystallized into pure rage. In Kingsley's racist worldview, this scene represented everything wrong with modern society. A black woman who didn't know her place, challenging a white police officer with 20 years of experience. His training and experience should have told him to assess the situation carefully, identify who he was dealing with, and proceed with appropriate caution. Instead, his prejudices blinded him to every warning sign that he was making a catastrophic mistake. "Ma'am, this is police business," Kingsley said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance and unquestioned authority. "I'm going to need you to step back and let us handle this situation properly." The other officers, Ashworth, Marcus Beaumont, and Sterling Fairfax, began to sense that something was shifting in ways they didn't understand. They had worked with Kingsley long enough to recognize the warning signs when his temper was about to explode, but they also noticed something about this woman that made them increasingly uncomfortable. Her vocabulary, her posture, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of four-armed officers, everything about her suggested she wasn't who Kingsley assumed she was. Judge Sterling remained perfectly still, her briefcase at her side, her posture radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down hostile courtrooms filled with aggressive attorneys, intimidating defendants, and corrupt officials without ever losing her composure or backing down from her principles. 25 years of civil rights law had taught her that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was when authority figures realized they couldn't intimidate you through threats or displays of power. "Officer, I'm simply asking about the legal basis for this detention," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that should have warned Kingsley he was dealing with someone far more knowledgeable about constitutional law than he assumed. "These appear to be federal employees leaving their workplace, and this is federal property, where specific jurisdictional limitations apply to local law enforcement activities." Her response demonstrated intimate knowledge of federal jurisdiction rules that most civilians wouldn't understand. The mention of specific jurisdictional limitations should have been a clear warning that she understood the complex legal framework governing police operations on federal property, knowledge that typically belonged to attorneys, federal agents, or judges rather than ordinary citizens. Kingsley's face darkened as his anger escalated beyond the point of rational thought. In his mind, this was a simple equation that had nothing to do with law or procedure. He was a police captain with 20 years of experience, and she was a civilian questioning his authority on the street. The fact that she was a black woman made it even more infuriating to him, triggering racist beliefs that had shaped his worldview for decades. In Kingsley's distorted perspective, there was a natural hierarchy in society where people needed to stay in their designated places, and black women challenging white police officers represented a fundamental threat to the order he had spent his career enforcing. His inability to recognize legitimate authority when it didn't fit his prejudices had blinded him to every indication that he was dealing with someone whose power far exceeded his own. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again," Kingsley said, stepping closer to Judge Sterling with aggressive body language designed to intimidate and establish dominance. "You need to move along right now, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs for interfering with a police investigation." The threat was both illegal and tactically stupid. Judge Sterling hadn't interfered with anything. She had simply asked legitimate questions about the constitutional basis for detaining federal employees on federal property. Threatening to arrest someone for asking about probable cause was itself a violation of the First Amendment right to seek information from government officials, especially when that person had done nothing to obstruct the investigation. But more importantly, Judge Sterling was now reaching into her jacket pocket with deliberate calm, withdrawing her federal judicial identification card. The gold seal of the United States District Court gleamed under the parking lot lights as she held it at eye level for Kingsley to see, though his rage had blinded him to everything except his perceived need to establish dominance over someone who had dared to question his authority. Judge Sterling could see exactly what was about to happen. She had spent decades in courtrooms watching people make decisions that would destroy their lives, and she recognized the signs of someone about to commit professional suicide through sheer arrogance and prejudice. But she also understood that sometimes the only way to protect constitutional rights was to force corrupt officials to reveal their true nature in ways that couldn't be ignored or covered up. "Captain Kingsley," she said, using his rank and name with precision while displaying her federal credentials, "I am Federal Judge Yvonne Sterling of the Southern District of Georgia. This is federal property, and I have both the authority and the responsibility to ensure constitutional procedures are followed." What they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by courthouse security, but by federal surveillance systems that capture every interaction on federal property, and these recordings can never be deleted or suppressed. The federal identification should have ended the confrontation immediately and completely. Federal judges held lifetime appointments with constitutional authority that superseded local law enforcement at every level. They were protected by federal law, federal security, and federal oversight that made them untouchable by local officials. Threatening or assaulting a federal judge was a federal crime that automatically triggered FBI involvement, federal prosecution, and federal oversight that no local political network could control or influence. But Kingsley, his vision clouded by rage and wounded pride, saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see: a black woman who had failed to show proper respect for his authority. The gold federal seal meant nothing to him because his racist ideology had convinced him that no black woman could possibly hold legitimate power that superseded his own. In his twisted worldview, she had to be lying, pretending, or somehow fraudulently claiming authority that couldn't possibly be real. Federal courthouse security cameras 7, 12, and 15 were capturing every moment of this interaction, from multiple angles with high-definition clarity that would preserve every detail of what was about to happen. The Federal Protective Service monitoring station had already flagged the incident when Judge Sterling's federal security badge had been detected in the vicinity of the police activity through the building's automated tracking system. Agent Maria Santos, monitoring federal security from the courthouse control room, was watching the live feed with growing alarm as she recognized Judge Sterling on the surveillance footage. Automatic protocols were beginning to activate that would escalate this situation beyond anything Kingsley could control or understand. Federal Protocol FPS 2847 required immediate intervention when a federal judge's safety was threatened, and Santos was already coordinating with the U.S. Marshals Service while federal agents prepared to respond to the scene. Officer Ashworth recognized the federal seal on Judge Sterling's identification and understood immediately that they were facing a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. As the newest member of the team, he hadn't yet been fully indoctrinated into Kingsley's culture of impunity and still retained enough integrity to recognize legitimate authority when he saw it. "Captain," Ashworth said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "that's a federal judge's ID. Maybe we should contact our supervisor and—" "I don't care if she's the Queen of England," Kingsley shouted, spittle flying from his lips as his rage reached a level that destroyed any remaining rationality. "She's interfering with police business, and she's going to learn some respect for law enforcement authority." The response revealed everything wrong with Kingsley's mindset. He literally didn't care about her legitimate authority because his prejudices had convinced him that no black woman could possibly outrank him in any meaningful way. His reference to learning respect showed that this confrontation had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with his need to establish racial dominance over someone who had challenged his authority. Judge Sterling remained motionless, but her mind was working with the precision of a judicial computer that had processed thousands of legal cases. She was mentally cataloging every violation of procedure, every constitutional transgression, every federal statute that was being broken in real time. More importantly, she was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple federal security systems that would preserve this evidence forever and make it available to federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations. The transformation in the other officers was visible and dramatic. They had gone from confident law enforcement professionals to men who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. Officer Ashworth looked like he was about to be sick as he understood that he was watching his captain assault a federal judge. Officer Beaumont was backing away from the scene, instinctively trying to distance himself from what was about to happen. Officer Fairfax was still recording everything on his body camera, as per department protocol, but his hands were shaking as he realized that this footage would likely be evidence in a federal criminal trial. Judge Sterling could see the trajectory of what was about to happen, with the clarity of someone who had spent decades watching people destroy their lives through poor decisions. She had seen defendants confess to crimes they didn't commit, attorneys sabotage their own cases, and prosecutors overreach in ways that invalidated years of investigation. But she had never seen someone about to commit professional suicide so completely and with such determination. "Captain Kingsley," she said, making one final attempt to prevent the catastrophe she could see coming, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor before this situation escalates further. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242 prohibits the deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law, and continuing this detention without probable cause constitutes a federal crime that carries serious penalties." Her recitation of the specific federal statute should have been the final warning that penetrated even Kingsley's rage-clouded consciousness. Only someone with intimate knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures would know the exact code number for civil rights violations, and only someone with real authority would be confident enough to cite federal law to a police captain while surrounded by armed officers. But Kingsley heard those words as the ultimate challenge to his authority, the final insult that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a defeat that he could never recover from in front of his officers, his department, and his community. The other officers were watching. The federal courthouse was in the background. This woman was questioning not just his judgment, but his very right to wear the badge and exercise authority over people he considered inferior. He made his decision with the finality of someone stepping off a cliff. Kingsley stepped forward with predatory aggression, grabbed Judge Sterling by her left arm with enough force to leave bruises, and shoved her backward against his patrol car with such violence that her briefcase fell to the ground, scattering sensitive federal case files across the asphalt, like evidence of his complete disregard for federal authority. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," he shouted, pressing his knee into her back while reaching for his handcuffs with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The sound of Judge Sterling's briefcase hitting the ground echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot that signaled the end of everything Kingsley had built over 20 years. Federal case files scattered in the humid Atlanta breeze, their official seals and classified markings clearly visible to the security cameras that were recording every moment of this historic catastrophe. And in that instant, Captain Preston Kingsley crossed a line that would trigger consequences he couldn't even imagine. The federal agents arriving weren't just responding to an incident. They were implementing protocols that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be covered up, and couldn't be ignored. What the FBI discovered in their database would expose 20 years of corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. Within 6 minutes of Agent Santos identifying Judge Sterling on the security footage, a series of federal protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 4 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, in what would become the largest police corruption investigation in Georgia history. 3 black SUVs with federal plates surrounded the scene in less than 90 seconds, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of federal agents who had responded to thousands of similar situations but had never dealt with an assault on a federal judge. Federal agents in tactical gear took positions around the scene with weapons drawn, not pointing them at anyone, but making it unmistakably clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that local police couldn't control, negotiate, or influence. Federal agents, announced Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the U.S. Marshal's Service, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone whose power derived directly from the Constitution rather than local politics. Release the individual immediately and step away from the vehicle. Santos had been a federal agent for 15 years, specializing in the protection of federal judges and the investigation of threats against federal officials. She had seen corrupt police officers try to intimidate federal authorities before, but she had never witnessed anything as blatantly criminal as a police captain physically assaulting a federal judge while being recorded by federal security systems. Kingsley looked up from Judge Sterling's prone form to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was a routine arrest into something that looked like a scene from a federal law enforcement operation. For the first time since this encounter began, doubt crept into his consciousness as he realized that his local political connections and departmental protection meant absolutely nothing when federal agents were involved. "This woman was interfering with a legitimate police investigation," Kingsley began, his voice carrying less conviction than before as he tried to maintain the fiction that he was conducting legitimate law enforcement rather than committing federal crimes. "Sir," Agent Santos interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority that no local official could challenge, "that woman is Federal Judge Yvonne Sterling. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back while we assess this situation." The words Federal Judge Yvonne Sterling hit Kingsley like a physical blow that shattered his remaining delusions about what he had just done. He had heard that name before in departmental briefings about federal oversight of police misconduct. Every law enforcement officer in Georgia knew that name because she was the judge who had sent corrupt cops to federal prison, the judge who had overseen landmark civil rights cases that had reformed 3 different police departments, and the judge who had the power to place entire law enforcement agencies under federal oversight. Meanwhile, FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was accessing the Bureau's law enforcement misconduct database from her mobile terminal in one of the federal vehicles, running Kingsley's name through systems that tracked patterns of police misconduct across multiple jurisdictions. What she discovered in those first few minutes would transform this from a single incident of assault into a federal conspiracy investigation that would ultimately destroy Kingsley's entire network of protection. The database search revealed a pattern that made Agent Walsh's stomach turn with its implications. 43 separate complaints of excessive force spanning 20 years, 27 specific allegations of racial bias documented by federal civil rights organizations. 15 federal lawsuits settled by the city with confidential agreements designed to prevent public scrutiny, and 7 internal affairs investigations that had all concluded with insufficient evidence despite compelling witness testimony and physical evidence. But what made this pattern truly damning was the systematic nature of the cover-ups. Every single internal affairs investigation had been conducted by the same detective, Lieutenant Vaughn Cartwright. Every single complaint had been dismissed through identical procedural technicalities that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the investigation process, often after receiving visits from officers associated with Kingsley's unit. Agent Walsh immediately contacted FBI headquarters in Atlanta, transmitting Kingsley's personnel records and the pattern analysis to federal prosecutors who specialized in police corruption cases. Within minutes, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres would be reviewing evidence for conspiracy charges under 18 U.S.C. 241, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights, a federal crime that carried penalties of up to 10 years in federal prison and applied to anyone who participated in the systematic cover-up of constitutional violations. If you believe that corrupt officers like Captain Kingsley should face federal justice for their actions, type justice below. The conspiracy charges were significant because they would apply not just to Kingsley, but to every supervisor, internal affairs detective, and city official who had participated in covering up his misconduct over the past 2 decades. Federal prosecutors had the resources and authority to investigate patterns of corruption that local oversight agencies had either missed or deliberately ignored, and the evidence they were uncovering suggested systematic failure at every level of accountability. Kingsley's hands fell away from Judge Sterling as if he had been electrocuted by the realization of what he had done. The handcuffs he had been reaching for clattered to the ground with a metallic sound that seemed to echo his career hitting rock bottom. His face went from flushed red to ash white in the span of 3 seconds as 20 years of protected misconduct came crashing down around him. Judge Sterling straightened her jacket with dignity that remained unshaken despite the physical assault, picked up her scattered legal documents with the help of Officer Ashworth, and turned to face Kingsley with the calm authority of someone who had just proven a point about power, constitutional rights, and the consequences of underestimating federal judicial authority. The other officers were now fully aware that they had witnessed something that would haunt their careers forever. Officer Ashworth was already calculating how to distance himself from Kingsley's obvious misconduct. Officer Beaumont was wondering if his own disciplinary record would withstand federal scrutiny. Officer Fairfax was realizing that his body camera footage would be evidence in federal court proceedings that could destroy multiple careers. But the real scope of what was about to unfold was only beginning to become clear as federal agents began coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies and federal prosecutors started reviewing decades of evidence that had been hidden by local political protection. But the corruption they uncovered was just the beginning of a network that had operated with impunity for decades. Judge Sterling was now speaking quietly with Agent Santos, providing a detailed account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal charges. Her memory for detail was legendary in legal circles. She could recall conversations verbatim years after they occurred, courtroom proceedings with perfect accuracy, and legal precedents with citations that law clerks had to verify in legal databases. Her credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute, built on 25 years of never having a case overturned due to factual errors or procedural mistakes. Agent Santos, you should know that Captain Kingsley displayed a pattern of behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated incident, Judge Sterling said, her voice carrying the analytical precision of someone who had spent decades identifying systemic problems in law enforcement. His immediate assumption that I was just another civilian who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic bias training issues within the department that go far beyond individual misconduct. Those words, systematic bias and training issues, were federal code for the kind of investigation that could place entire police departments under federal oversight through consent decrees that would reshape every aspect of law enforcement operations. Kingsley, standing 20 feet away in federal custody, could hear enough of the conversation to understand that Judge Sterling wasn't just filing charges against him personally. She was triggering a comprehensive review of his entire department that would examine hiring practices, training protocols, supervision procedures, and accountability mechanisms. Agent Walsh was now coordinating with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., to be uploading evidence and analysis that would trigger federal oversight procedures, reserved for the most serious cases of institutional corruption. The evidence she had compiled in just 2 hours was sufficient to initiate a pattern and practice investigation under 42 U.S.C. 14141, the federal statute that allowed the Justice Department to sue entire police departments for systemic constitutional violations and force comprehensive reforms through federal court supervision. The financial implications alone were staggering for the city. Federal oversight would cost millions of dollars in monitoring fees, required reforms, and legal settlements with victims of past misconduct. Every case Kingsley had worked in his 20-year career would need to be reviewed for constitutional violations, potentially resulting in hundreds of overturned convictions if they were based on tainted evidence or unconstitutional procedures. More importantly, the federal investigation was expanding beyond Kingsley to examine the network of supervisors, internal affairs detectives, and city officials who had enabled his misconduct for 2 decades. Federal agents had the resources and legal authority to subpoena records, interview witnesses, and examine financial transactions that local oversight agencies couldn't access or had deliberately avoided investigating. Lieutenant Commander Logan Pemberton arrived at the federal courthouse with the department's legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, expecting to manage what they hoped would be a relatively routine excessive force complaint that could be handled through the usual channels of departmental discipline and possible civil settlement. What they found instead was a federal crime scene with evidence technicians photographing skid marks on the pavement, federal agents collecting Judge Sterling's scattered legal documents as evidence, and multiple federal agencies coordinating what was clearly becoming the largest police corruption investigation in Georgia history. Pemberton had known Kingsley for 15 years, having come up through the ranks together in an era when police misconduct was routinely covered up through informal networks of protection and mutual loyalty. They had covered for each other during internal affairs investigations, shared an understanding about how to manage problematic complaints from the community, and built careers on the assumption that their network of protection would always shield them from serious consequences. But seeing Kingsley standing next to his patrol car with federal agents documenting every inch of the scene, while forensic technicians collected evidence that would be presented in federal court, Pemberton realized that their network of protection was about to be tested like never before. Federal investigations operated by different rules, with different standards of evidence and different consequences that no amount of local political influence could mitigate or control. Captain Kingsley, Pemberton said carefully, fully aware that federal agents were recording every word and that anything he said could be used as evidence in federal court proceedings, you are relieved of duty pending the outcome of this investigation. Richardson will handle all communications from this point forward. The relief of duty was immediate and non-negotiable, but it also represented acknowledgement that the department could no longer protect Kingsley through its usual mechanisms of internal discipline and administrative leave. Federal involvement meant that local solutions were no longer possible, and the department's primary concern was now limiting the damage to other officers and supervisors who might be implicated in the expanding investigation. Attorney Richardson was sweating despite the cool evening air, his nervous demeanor reflecting his understanding that this case was completely outside his area of expertise. He specialized in police misconduct defense at the local level, where cases were handled by county prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate plea deals or dismissals based on political considerations and professional relationships. Federal charges were a completely different world, a world where political considerations meant nothing, professional relationships provided no protection, and the evidence either supported charges or it didn't. Your Honor, Richardson approached Judge Sterling with obvious reluctance and profound respect. I'm David Richardson, representing Captain Kingsley. I was hoping we might discuss the possibility of resolving this matter through Mr. Richardson. Judge Sterling interrupted with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with similar situations countless times throughout her career. This is now a federal criminal matter involving assault on a federal judge, civil rights violations, and potential conspiracy charges. Any communications regarding this case should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office, which has exclusive jurisdiction over federal crimes. Richardson's face went pale as he realized that Judge Sterling was not only the victim of the assault, but also a federal judge with intimate knowledge of the legal procedures that would govern Kingsley's prosecution. Her response made it clear that this case would receive the full attention of federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations and viewed police misconduct as a priority area for aggressive prosecution. The investigation was also expanding beyond individual misconduct to examine institutional failures that had enabled Kingsley's behavior for 2 decades. Federal agents were beginning to subpoena records from the Police Department, Internal Affairs Division, City Attorney's Office, and Mayor's Administration to determine how complaints against Kingsley had been systematically buried and whether city officials had knowledge of his pattern of misconduct. Agent Santos was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had just arrived from the Atlanta field office with a mobile forensic unit specifically designed for complex federal investigations involving government corruption. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of misconduct, financial irregularities, and conspiracy networks that local investigations typically missed or ignored. Agent Walsh, Judge Sterling said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose recommendations carried significant weight with federal law enforcement, I believe you'll want to review Captain Kingsley's entire disciplinary record as part of your investigation. Based on his behavior tonight and his apparent comfort with violating federal law, I suspect you'll find a pattern of constitutional violations that his department has systematically failed to address. Agent Walsh nodded, while making detailed notes that would trigger comprehensive subpoenas for Kingsley's personnel file, internal affairs records, training documentation, and every complaint filed against him in his 20-year career. Federal investigators had access to records and resources that local oversight agencies often couldn't obtain or had deliberately avoided requesting, and their investigation would examine not just Kingsley's individual misconduct, but the institutional failures that had protected him. The scope of the federal investigation was becoming clear as multiple agencies coordinated their response to what was no longer just an assault case, but a comprehensive examination of police corruption that could result in federal oversight of the entire department. Judge Sterling's assault had triggered automatic federal protocols that would examine every aspect of how the department handled misconduct complaints, trained officers in constitutional law, and supervised personnel with histories of excessive force. Evidence proved this wasn't just corruption, it was organized conspiracy. By 11:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after Kingsley had first grabbed Judge Sterling's arm in what he thought was a routine assertion of police authority, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 48 hours. The speed of the federal response reflected both the seriousness of assaulting a federal judge and the overwhelming nature of the evidence that federal agents had compiled in just a few hours of investigation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres was the Civil Rights Division's specialist in police misconduct cases, having successfully prosecuted 47 law enforcement officers for federal civil rights violations in his 12-year career with the Department of Justice. He had developed a reputation for building unbeatable cases against corrupt police officers, and his conviction rate in civil rights cases was nearly perfect. When his phone rang at 11:15 p.m. with news that a police captain had physically assaulted federal judge Yvonne Sterling, Torres immediately understood that this would be the highest-profile case of his career. The evidence was overwhelming in ways that made prosecution almost inevitable. Federal security cameras had captured the entire incident from multiple angles, with high-definition clarity that preserved every detail of Kingsley's assault. Judge Sterling's testimony would be unimpeachable. Federal judges were among the most credible witnesses in the American legal system, and her reputation for accuracy and integrity was legendary among federal prosecutors. The pattern of misconduct in Kingsley's personnel file provided clear evidence of willful constitutional violations that met the federal standard for civil rights crimes. But what made this case truly devastating for Kingsley and his network was the evidence of conspiracy that federal investigators were uncovering. Phone records, email communications, and financial transactions were revealing a systematic effort to cover up Kingsley's misconduct that involved multiple officers, supervisors, and internal affairs personnel. The conspiracy evidence would allow federal prosecutors to charge not just Kingsley, but everyone who had participated in protecting him from accountability over the past 2 decades. Torres was reviewing federal statutes that would apply to Kingsley's case: 18 U.S.C. 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, which carried a maximum penalty of 10 years in federal prison; 18 U.S.C. 245, federal hate crime statute, which enhanced penalties when victims were targeted because of their race; and 18 U.S.C. 241, conspiracy to violate civil rights, which could be applied to anyone who had participated in covering up Kingsley's misconduct. The hate crime enhancement was particularly significant because Kingsley's own words and behavior had demonstrated racial animus in his treatment of Judge Sterling. Federal prosecutors had clear evidence that his assault was motivated by his racist belief that a black woman couldn't possibly hold legitimate authority over a white police officer, making this case a textbook example of how racial prejudice led to federal civil rights violations. Federal investigators had also uncovered evidence of multi-department coordination in covering up Kingsley's misconduct that suggested a conspiracy reaching beyond his immediate supervisors. Phone records revealed regular communication between Kingsley, Lieutenant Cartwright, and supervisors in 3 other law enforcement agencies in the region. Email records showed coordination of witness interviews and evidence collection designed to protect Kingsley from accountability, while ensuring that complaints against him would be dismissed through procedural technicalities. The financial investigation was revealing systematic misuse of federal funding that added another layer of federal crimes to the case. The police department had received over $2 million in federal grants for community policing, civil rights training, and accountability measures over the past 5 years. Instead of implementing proper oversight mechanisms as required by federal grant conditions, the money had been used to expand the very programs that enabled officer misconduct while avoiding the accountability measures that federal funding was supposed to ensure. Grant fraud was a federal crime that carried significant penalties and could result in the loss of all federal funding for the department. More importantly, it demonstrated that city officials had knowingly accepted federal money for accountability programs while systematically undermining those same programs to protect corrupt officers like Kingsley. Agent Walsh's investigation was also revealing evidence that Kingsley's network had protected other officers with similar patterns of misconduct, creating a department-wide culture where constitutional violations were routine and accountability was systematically avoided. Federal subpoenas were uncovering internal affairs files that had been deliberately destroyed, witness interviews that had been conducted in ways designed to discourage testimony, and evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from police custody when it might have supported complaints against officers. The pattern was so systematic and well documented that federal prosecutors were confident they could prove conspiracy charges against multiple defendants. The evidence showed that Kingsley's misconduct wasn't the result of poor training or inadequate supervision. It was the product of an organized effort to enable constitutional violations while avoiding federal oversight. Chief of Police Parker Sinclair was now meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and federal mediators to discuss the terms of federal oversight that would inevitably be imposed on the department. The incident with Judge Sterling had accelerated federal investigations that had been building for years, and the city was now facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of police operations while costing millions of dollars in required reforms. "Chief," Mayor Patricia Johnson said, her voice tight with controlled anger as she realized the full scope of the crisis facing the city, I need to know how many more Preston Kingsleys we have in this department, and I need to know exactly how we're going to prevent this from ever happening again. Sinclair knew that his answer would be devastating for the city's budget and the department's reputation. The federal investigation had already identified dozens of officers with complaint patterns similar to Kingsley's, and preventing future incidents would require systemic changes that the department had resisted for decades, while federal oversight would monitor every aspect of their operations for years to come. Federal oversight was beginning, but what came next would reshape accountability forever. At 2:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Vaughn Cartwright at his home in Marietta, Georgia, executing a federal warrant based on evidence that Cartwright had systematically suppressed investigations into Kingsley's misconduct for over a decade. The arrest was conducted with the precision and overwhelming force that federal agencies reserved for cases involving government corruption, with agents simultaneously searching Cartwright's home, office, and personal vehicles for evidence of the conspiracy that had protected Kingsley for 20 years. The federal warrant was based on evidence that made the conspiracy charges virtually unbeatable in federal court. Email records recovered from the department's servers showed that Cartwright had coached Kingsley on how to write incident reports that would withstand scrutiny from federal investigators. Phone records revealed detailed coordination between Cartwright and Kingsley before internal affairs interviews, including specific strategies for discrediting witnesses and undermining physical evidence that might support complaints. Financial records were even more damaging, indicating that Kingsley had helped Cartwright obtain a promotion to lieutenant by providing false testimony in another officer's disciplinary hearing, while Cartwright had reciprocated by ensuring that complaints against Kingsley would be dismissed regardless of their merit. Bank records showed unexplained cash deposits in both men's accounts that coincided with the dismissal of high-profile misconduct complaints, suggesting that their conspiracy might have involved financial payments from external sources. But the most devastating evidence was found in Cartwright's personal files, detailed records of every complaint against Kingsley over 20 years, along with strategies for undermining each investigation. The files showed that Cartwright had maintained a systematic approach to protecting Kingsley that included intimidating witnesses, destroying evidence, falsifying reports, and coordinating with other supervisors to ensure that accountability would never reach Kingsley, regardless of how compelling the evidence against him might be. Cartwright's arrest meant that other officers who had participated in the cover-up network would also face federal charges within days. The FBI had identified at least 17 additional officers who had knowledge of Kingsley's pattern of misconduct and had either actively participated in covering it up or had failed to report federal crimes as required by law. Federal prosecutors were preparing charges against supervisors, detectives, and administrators who had enabled the conspiracy through their actions or deliberate inaction. Kingsley woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on Twitter. His photograph was being broadcast on national television, and civil rights organizations across the country were using his case as a prime example of everything wrong with American policing. The story had been picked up by CNN, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and every major news network in the country, transforming him from an unknown local police captain into a national symbol of police corruption and racism. The media coverage was particularly damaging because it included detailed reporting on his 20-year pattern of misconduct that federal investigators had uncovered. News organizations had obtained copies of complaint files, lawsuit settlements, and internal affairs reports that revealed the systematic nature of his constitutional violations and the institutional protection he had received from his department and city government. Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights activist and scholar, issued a statement that captured the national significance of the case. Captain Kingsley's assault on Judge Sterling represents the violent collision between America's legacy of racial oppression and the constitutional authority that protects our democracy. When police officers believe they can assault federal judges with impunity, our entire system of justice is under attack, and federal intervention becomes necessary to preserve the rule of law. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, announced that they would monitor Kingsley's federal prosecution and push for maximum sentences as a deterrent to other police officers who might consider similar acts of racial violence. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, issued a statement calling for comprehensive federal oversight of the entire police department and demanding that city officials be held accountable for enabling Kingsley's misconduct through years of deliberate indifference. Kingsley's personal life was disintegrating as rapidly as his professional career. His wife, Linda, was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of racist arrogance that had revealed 20 years of hidden corruption. Their house would likely be seized through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Their savings would be drained by legal fees, and their family would face years of social ostracism as the scope of Kingsley's crimes became public knowledge. The police union's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had reviewed the preliminary evidence and delivered news that shattered Kingsley's last hope for avoiding federal prison. "Preston," she said during their emergency meeting, "this isn't a case we can defend successfully. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a federal judge with impeccable credibility, and the FBI has video documentation of everything that happened. My professional advice is to negotiate for the minimum sentence and hope that federal prosecutors are feeling generous, though I should warn you that they rarely show mercy in cases involving assaults on federal judges." But federal prosecutors had no incentive to feel generous when dealing with police officers who violated the civil rights of federal judges. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a reputation to maintain, political pressure to demonstrate that no one was above the law, and a clear mandate from the Department of Justice to aggressively prosecute civil rights violations by law enforcement officers. The investigation was also expanding beyond law enforcement to include city officials who had enabled the corruption through deliberate indifference or active participation. Federal agents were reviewing budget allocations, examining settlement agreements, and interviewing former city employees who had raised concerns about police misconduct only to be ignored, transferred, or retaliated against by officials who prioritized protecting the department over protecting citizens' constitutional rights. Judge Sterling had one final move that would ensure this never happened again. 6 weeks after the assault that had destroyed Kingsley's career and exposed decades of institutional corruption, Judge Sterling stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee in a packed hearing room to testify about legislation that would transform police accountability nationwide. The Federal Police Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Kingsley case and drafted with input from civil rights organizations across the country, represented the most comprehensive police reform legislation in American history. The hearing room was filled with civil rights activists, law enforcement officials, journalists, and family members of victims of police misconduct who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in the struggle for constitutional accountability. Television cameras broadcast the proceedings live to millions of Americans who had followed the Kingsley case and were demanding systemic changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. "Senators," Judge Sterling testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose personal experience with police corruption had given her unique insights into the institutional failures that enabled constitutional violations. "Captain Kingsley's assault on my dignity was also an assault on the constitutional principles that govern our democracy. But his crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful accountable and protect even the most vulnerable." The committee room fell silent as Judge Sterling described the systematic corruption that had protected Kingsley for 20 years, the federal intervention that had finally brought justice, and the comprehensive reforms that would be necessary to prevent similar networks of protection from operating in the future. Her testimony was being broadcast live on C-SPAN, CNN, and every major news network, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a defining moment in civil rights history. Senator Elizabeth Warren, chair of the committee, asked the question that captured the national significance of the case. "Judge Sterling, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a federal judge when Captain Kingsley assaulted you that night?" Judge Sterling's answer was devastating in its simplicity and historical accuracy. Senator Preston Kingsley had assaulted ordinary citizens for 20 years without facing any meaningful consequences. The only difference was that I had the constitutional authority to trigger federal intervention, and the legal knowledge to ensure that intervention was effective. Most victims of police misconduct don't have access to federal courts, don't understand federal civil rights law, and can't compel the kind of comprehensive investigation that exposed this corruption network. That exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that police accountability required external oversight rather than the internal investigation processes that had systematically failed to protect citizens' constitutional rights. The clip was replayed on news broadcasts across the country and shared millions of times on social media as evidence of why federal oversight was necessary to ensure constitutional policing. The Federal Police Accountability Act that Judge Sterling was advocating represented a revolutionary approach to police oversight. The legislation would require all police departments receiving federal funding to implement independent oversight of excessive force complaints, mandatory body cameras for all officers with footage that would be automatically uploaded to federal databases, federal review of all use of force incidents involving injuries or deaths, and automatic termination for officers with documented patterns of misconduct. The financial incentives were designed to ensure compliance. Departments that failed to implement required reforms would lose federal funding that typically represented 15 to 20% of their budgets, while departments that exceeded accountability standards would receive additional federal grants for community policing and officer training programs. The legislation also included whistleblower protections for police officers who reported misconduct by colleagues, federal oversight of police union contracts that prevented accountability, and civilian oversight boards with subpoena power and independent investigative authority. Most importantly, it would create a national database of police misconduct that would prevent officers like Kingsley from moving between departments to escape accountability for their actions. During her testimony, Judge Sterling also revealed the scope of the ongoing federal investigation that had been triggered by her assault. Senators, the investigation into Captain Kingsley's misconduct has uncovered evidence of institutional corruption in dozens of police departments across multiple states. The pattern of abuse, cover-ups, and federal civil rights violations is so systematic that it represents a crisis in American policing that requires federal intervention to resolve. The numbers were staggering. Federal investigators had identified over 200 officers with patterns of misconduct similar to Kingsley's, examined more than 1,000 cases where complaints had been systematically dismissed without proper investigation, and uncovered evidence of conspiracy to violate civil rights in 23 different law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. The legislative response was swift and bipartisan, reflecting national consensus that comprehensive police reform was necessary to restore public trust in law enforcement. The Federal Police Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 78 to 22, with support from both parties that demonstrated the political power of Judge Sterling's testimony and the public demand for accountability that her case had generated. The legislation inspired by this case would transform police accountability nationwide. On a cold morning in February, 8 months after he had assaulted Judge Sterling in what he thought was a routine assertion of police authority, Preston Kingsley stood before federal Judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his life and serve as a deterrent to other police officers who might consider similar acts of constitutional violation. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity with civil rights activists, victims of Kingsley's abuse throughout his 20-year career, journalists covering what had become the most significant police accountability case in Georgia history, and law enforcement officials who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in federal civil rights enforcement. Judge Sterling sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the dignity and federal authority that Kingsley had tried to violate through racist aggression and institutional protection. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres presented evidence that painted Kingsley as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 2 decades, while systematically avoiding accountability through conspiracy, intimidation, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of city government. The federal sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 47 people who had been brutalized, falsely arrested, or intimidated by Kingsley and his confederates, providing a comprehensive picture of the constitutional violations that had been enabled by institutional protection. "Your Honor," Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law and constitutional justice, "Preston Kingsley used his badge and gun to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back, relying on a network of protection that enabled his crimes for 20 years. He believed that his uniform made him untouchable, that his authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was wrong on every count, and this sentence must reflect the seriousness of assaulting federal authority and violating citizens' constitutional rights. Stories of justice and accountability inspire people around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of constitutional protection are reaching." Federal Judge Bradley had spent weeks reviewing the extensive evidence of Kingsley's misconduct, including the 20 years of documentation that federal investigators had compiled showing systematic constitutional violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights, and the institutional failures that had enabled his crimes. The evidence showed that Kingsley had been the architect of the corruption rather than its victim, making maximum sentences appropriate under federal sentencing guidelines. The sentence was devastating and comprehensive. 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, 3 years of supervised release with restrictions on his movement and associations, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt activities including his house and pension, and permanent prohibition from any law enforcement employment at any level of government. The sentence would be served in federal facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other police officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their oaths of office. Kingsley would serve his time at the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium-security facility that housed corrupt government officials and white-collar criminals. The federal prison system offered no special protection for former law enforcement officers, and Kingsley's status as a corrupt cop who had assaulted a federal judge would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by police misconduct throughout their lives. The ripple effects of Kingsley's sentencing extended far beyond his individual case. Lieutenant Vaughn Cartwright received 10 years in federal prison for his role in covering up Kingsley's crimes and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Lieutenant Commander Logan Pemberton received 8 years for participating in the conspiracy and failing to report federal crimes as required by law. 17 other officers received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years in prison for their roles in the corruption network, making this the largest police corruption prosecution in Georgia history. The financial cost to the city was staggering and ongoing. Federal oversight would continue for at least 5 years, costing millions of dollars in monitoring fees, required reforms, and compliance measures. The city faced over $50 million in civil rights settlements with victims of the corruption network, while insurance companies had cancelled the city's liability coverage due to the systematic nature of the constitutional violations. Judge Sterling watched Kingsley's sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen federal justice delivered through proper constitutional processes, but her focus was already shifting to the systemic changes that would prevent future Preston Kingsleys from operating with impunity. Her work was far from over. The Federal Police Accountability Act was moving through Congress, and her testimony would be crucial to ensuring that comprehensive reforms would be implemented nationwide. This sentence sends a clear message to every law enforcement officer in America, Judge Sterling told reporters after the hearing. No one is above the law. Not police officers, not supervisors, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the constitutional rights they swore to protect. Federal justice will reach anyone who believes their badge gives them permission to commit crimes against the citizens they serve. The message was being heard across the law enforcement community, where Kingsley's case had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of police misconduct in an era of federal oversight and constitutional accountability. The sentence was devastating, but systemic changes were just beginning. The federal pattern and practice investigation triggered by Kingsley's assault had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive and systematic that the Department of Justice had no choice but to place the entire police force under comprehensive federal oversight, only the fourth time in U.S. history that such drastic federal intervention had been necessary to ensure constitutional policing. Federal Monitor Dr. Sarah Chen, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police reform and institutional transformation, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of law enforcement operations over the next 5 years. Her mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community oversight mechanisms with real authority, federal review of all hiring and promotion decisions, and transformation of police culture through constitutional training and accountability measures. The evidence uncovered in the Kingsley investigation reveals institutional failure at every level of this police department. Dr. Chen announced at her first public meeting, which was broadcast live and attended by hundreds of community members who had suffered under the previous system of police impunity. This department has systematically protected officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights, while retaliating against officers who attempted to report misconduct or uphold their oaths of office. The federal oversight agreement was unprecedented in its scope and detail. Every police policy would be rewritten to comply with constitutional standards and federal civil rights law. Every officer would undergo extensive retraining in constitutional policing, de-escalation techniques, and implicit bias recognition. Every use of force would be reviewed by federal monitors and civilian oversight boards with subpoena power and independent investigative authority. The financial cost of federal oversight was staggering, but necessary for constitutional compliance. The city was required to pay for Dr. Chen's team of federal monitors, implement new technology systems to ensure transparency and accountability, upgrade training facilities and curricula, and settle hundreds of civil rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of departmental corruption became clear through federal investigation. But the results of federal oversight were dramatic and measurable within the first year of implementation. Excessive force complaints dropped by 67%, citizen satisfaction with police services increased by 45%, and federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in civil rights violations by law enforcement officers. Community trust in policing, which had been at historic lows, began to recover as residents saw real changes in police behavior and accountability. The transformation was not without resistance from officers who had benefited from the old system of impunity and political protection. Some police officers organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making law enforcement impossible and endangering public safety. However, community support for reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed federal oversight were voted out of office by citizens who demanded constitutional policing. Officer Quinn Ashworth, the rookie who had witnessed Kingsley's assault on Judge Sterling and had tried to warn his captain about the catastrophic mistake he was making, became a federal whistleblower whose testimony helped convict 17 additional officers of civil rights violations. His cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt colleagues had made him a target for retaliation from officers who remained loyal to the old system. Officer Ashworth did what every police officer swears to do when they take their oath, Judge Sterling said at his commendation ceremony, which was attended by federal officials and civil rights leaders. He chose to protect and serve the Constitution rather than protect and serve corruption. His courage in speaking truth to power demonstrates that good police officers can be allies in the fight for constitutional accountability. The federal reforms were creating a new model of policing that was being studied and replicated in departments across the country. Community policing initiatives were bringing officers and residents together to solve problems collaboratively, rather than through confrontation and arrest. Officer training focused on constitutional law, de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency rather than military-style tactics and US versus them mentality. The transformation extended beyond the police department to include comprehensive criminal justice reform. The district attorney's office was required to review every conviction obtained through testimony or evidence provided by officers connected to the corruption network. Hundreds of cases were overturned when federal investigators determined that they were based on false testimony, planted evidence, or constitutional violations. New hiring standards ensured that officers with histories of misconduct couldn't be employed by the department, while psychological evaluations and background investigations were expanded to identify candidates who might be prone to constitutional violations. Officer evaluation and promotion processes were restructured to reward constitutional policing and community engagement rather than arrest numbers and aggressive enforcement. The police union that had initially defended Kingsley and other corrupt officers was forced to implement new policies prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal civil rights violations. Union leadership was replaced by reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than impunity, and union contracts were renegotiated to eliminate provisions that had prevented accountability for misconduct. The transformation was complete, but the legacy would last generations. President Biden signed the Federal Police Accountability Act into law on a sunny day in October, with Judge Sterling standing beside him on the south lawn of the White House as he used multiple pens to ensure that pieces of the historic signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. The ceremony was attended by families of victims of police misconduct, civil rights leaders, and law enforcement officials who supported constitutional accountability. This law ensures that what happened to Judge Sterling and what Preston Kingsley did to hundreds of victims over 20 years can never again receive institutional protection, President Biden said during the signing ceremony, which was broadcast live to millions of Americans who had followed the case from its beginning. We are sending a clear message that in America, no one is above the law, and everyone deserves equal protection under the Constitution. The Kingsley case had become a template for federal intervention in corrupt law enforcement agencies, providing a roadmap for investigating institutional misconduct and implementing comprehensive reforms. The Department of Justice used the precedent established by Judge Sterling's case to place 12 additional police departments under federal oversight, applying the same accountability measures that had transformed Kingsley's department into a model of constitutional policing. The national impact of the legislation was immediate and far-reaching. Police departments across the country began implementing accountability measures voluntarily rather than risk federal intervention, while law enforcement organizations that had previously opposed reform began advocating for professional standards and constitutional compliance. The cultural shift in policing was dramatic, with officers understanding that misconduct would no longer be protected by institutional loyalty or political connections. Judge Sterling's role in exposing police corruption and advocating for comprehensive reform earned her national recognition as one of the most influential figures in civil rights law. She received the Civil Rights Award from the NAACP, the Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential people fighting government corruption and protecting constitutional rights. But for Judge Sterling, the real victory wasn't the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic reforms would protect future victims from experiencing what she had endured in that courthouse parking lot and what countless others had suffered under corrupt police officers like Preston Kingsley. Judge Sterling continued her work on police reform through her position on the Federal Advisory Committee on Police Accountability, helping to implement the oversight mechanisms that would prevent future Preston Kingsleys from operating with impunity. Her recommendations were being implemented in law enforcement agencies across the country, creating a new standard of constitutional accountability that was transforming American policing. Maria Rodriguez, whose teenage son had been brutalized by Kingsley 3 years earlier in an incident that had been covered up by Internal Affairs, spoke at the Federal Police Accountability Act signing ceremony with tears in her eyes. Judge Sterling showed us that dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her strength and the federal investigation she triggered, my son will grow up in a world where police officers know they will be held accountable for their actions. The transformation was visible in measurable outcomes across the country. Crime rates remained stable or decreased in departments under federal oversight, while community trust in law enforcement increased dramatically. Officer recruitment improved, as departments attracted candidates who wanted to serve constitutionally rather than participate in cultures of impunity, and police legitimacy was restored through transparency and accountability. Preston Kingsley was serving his federal sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, where his status as a corrupt police officer who had assaulted a federal judge made him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by law enforcement throughout their lives. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked multiple times and was being held in protective custody for his own safety, an ironic reversal for someone who had spent 20 years terrorizing others with impunity. His appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case without comment. Legal experts noted that Kingsley's conviction was so clear-cut and the evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the case or the appropriateness of his sentence. The financial settlements with Kingsley's victims totaled over $30 million, paid by the city through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic misconduct that federal investigation had revealed. The insurance crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover law enforcement agencies without comprehensive accountability measures and federal oversight. Judge Sterling's final words at the Senate hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with Preston Kingsley and its impact on American constitutional law. What began as one man's racist assault has become a catalyst for constitutional transformation that will protect generations of Americans from government abuse. The historical significance of the case extended far beyond individual justice to represent a fundamental shift in how America approached police accountability and constitutional enforcement. Legal scholars were already analyzing the case as a watershed moment in civil rights law, comparable to landmark Supreme Court decisions that had expanded constitutional protections and federal oversight of local government institutions. The ripple effects continued to spread across American society as other victims of police misconduct found courage to come forward, knowing that federal law enforcement would take their complaints seriously and investigate patterns of constitutional violations with the full resources of the Justice Department. The National Civil Rights Database, established as part of the Federal Police Accountability Act, was receiving thousands of complaints that were being investigated by federal agents trained specifically in civil rights enforcement. International attention focused on the case as well, with human rights organizations around the world citing Judge Sterling's experience as evidence that even advanced democracies required constant vigilance to protect constitutional rights and prevent government abuse. The case was studied in law schools, police academies, and human rights institutes across multiple countries as an example of how individual courage could trigger systematic reform. The police department that had once protected Preston Kingsley was now recognized as a national model for constitutional law enforcement, with community trust ratings that were the highest in the region and crime rates that had actually decreased under federal oversight. The transformation demonstrated that accountability and effectiveness were not mutually exclusive, but rather that constitutional policing was more effective at protecting public safety than the culture of impunity that had previously dominated. Officer training programs based on the federal reforms were being implemented in police academies nationwide, with curricula that emphasized constitutional law, community engagement, de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency, rather than the military-style tactics that had characterized traditional police training. New officers were being taught that their primary obligation was to the Constitution, rather than to institutional loyalty or collegial protection. The financial impact of the reforms was significant, but ultimately positive for communities that had suffered under corrupt policing. While federal oversight was expensive, the cost of settlements, lawsuits, and community distrust had been far higher under the previous system. Insurance companies were offering lower rates to departments that could demonstrate constitutional compliance and community trust, creating economic incentives for accountability. Political leaders, who had initially opposed federal oversight, were beginning to acknowledge its effectiveness as community satisfaction with police services reached historic highs. Mayor Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the crisis created by decades of institutional protection for corrupt officers, became a national advocate for federal police accountability standards and was frequently invited to speak about the transformation her city had experienced. "We learned that protecting bad cops doesn't protect good cops or public safety," Mayor Johnson said during a national conference on police reform. "Federal oversight gave us the tools and authority to implement changes that our community had been demanding for decades, and the results speak for themselves in terms of both constitutional compliance and crime reduction." The legislation inspired by Judge Sterling's case was being used as a model for international police reform initiatives, with countries around the world studying American innovations in federal oversight and constitutional accountability. The United Nations Human Rights Council cited the Federal Police Accountability Act as an example of how national governments could address systematic human rights violations by local authorities. Universities were establishing research centers focused on police accountability and constitutional enforcement, with Judge Sterling serving as a visiting scholar and lecturer who shared her expertise with students, researchers, and policymakers. Her academic work was contributing to a growing body of scholarship on how legal institutions could be reformed to better protect constitutional rights and prevent government abuse. The cultural impact extended into popular media, with documentaries, books, and television programs examining the case and its broader implications for American democracy. The story resonated with audiences because it demonstrated that individual courage and constitutional authority could triumph over entrenched corruption and institutional protection, providing hope that systematic change was possible even in the face of seemingly overwhelming opposition. Preston Kingsley's name had become synonymous with police corruption and the consequences of racist abuse of authority. His case was studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how institutional protection could enable decades of constitutional violations, while his federal prosecution demonstrated that no one was above the law when federal oversight was properly applied. The broader network of corruption that had protected Kingsley was completely dismantled, with federal prosecutors continuing to investigate and prosecute cases that emerged from the comprehensive review of police misconduct. The investigation had revealed corruption in neighboring jurisdictions, leading to federal oversight agreements in multiple cities and counties that had previously operated with minimal accountability. Community organizations that had struggled for decades to address police misconduct were now working collaboratively with reformed police departments to address public safety challenges through constitutional methods. Neighborhood groups that had once viewed police as occupying forces were participating in community policing initiatives that emphasized problem-solving and relationship building rather than enforcement and arrest. The transformation was particularly significant for communities of color that had borne the brunt of police misconduct under the previous system. Federal oversight had eliminated racial disparities in traffic stops, arrests, and use of force, while community trust in law enforcement was being rebuilt through transparency, accountability, and genuine engagement with residents who had previously been viewed as adversaries rather than partners in public safety. Young people who had grown up fearing police interactions were beginning to see law enforcement as protectors of constitutional rights rather than threats to their safety and dignity. Police departments were implementing youth engagement programs that emphasized education about constitutional rights and legal procedures, creating positive interactions that replaced the adversarial relationships that had characterized previous policing approaches. The legacy of Judge Sterling's courage extended beyond law enforcement to inspire broader discussions about government accountability, constitutional rights, and the responsibility of public officials to serve the Constitution rather than their own interests or institutional loyalty. Her example demonstrated that individuals with constitutional authority had both the power and the obligation to confront corruption regardless of personal risk or political consequences. And that's how one moment of racist aggression against a federal judge destroyed a 20-year career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive reform, and proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. Preston Kingsley thought he could assault Judge Sterling with impunity, relying on 2 decades of institutional protection and racist assumptions about power and authority. Instead, he learned that some people hold constitutional power he never imagined, and disrespecting federal judicial authority carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life while protecting countless others from similar abuse. The story of federal Judge Yvonne Sterling and Captain Preston Kingsley became more than just a case study in police accountability. It became a defining moment in American civil rights history that demonstrated the power of constitutional authority to overcome entrenched corruption and protect the vulnerable from government abuse. 20 years of hidden misconduct were exposed, systematic reforms were implemented, and federal oversight ensured that constitutional rights would be protected for generations to come. Most importantly, Judge Sterling's courage in the face of racist violence proved that dignity, knowledge, and constitutional authority could triumph over hatred, ignorance, and institutional corruption. Her refusal to be intimidated by Kingsley's aggression triggered changes that transformed not just one police department, but American policing as a whole, creating a legacy of accountability that will protect constitutional rights for decades to come. In the end, Preston Kingsley's moment of racist arrogance became the catalyst for the most comprehensive police reform in American history, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to accept it. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for accountability means everything. If these stories of constitutional protection inspire you, please subscribe to join our community, standing up for civil rights and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of federal law to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable.